Hey Unwrappers, what Christmas gift do you get the person who has everything, including a healthy sense of curiosity about current affairs and culture? The answer, of course, is a subscription to The Week, to keep your friends and family up to date on the big issues and also to entertain them with lighter stories they may have missed. Well, this December, we're giving Unwrapped listeners a special discount on Christmas offers from The Week. You can get 6 weeks completely free and then save an extra £5 on a quarterly subscription for any package. Visit theweek.com/flash24 to find out more and enter promo code FLASH24 to claim your offer. That's promo code FLASH24 at theweek.com/flash24. It's the week ending Friday the 20th of December, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen Ukraine killing a high-ranking Russian general in Moscow, the UK government refusing to compensate the WASPy women over historic changes to the state pension age, and the BBC announcing Grace Dent will be replacing Greg Wallace on MasterChef. You can read all you need to know about everything that matters in The Week magazine, but we're here to bring you some stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann, and let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from the Week's digital team is Rebecca Messina, plus we welcome back journalist Catriona Stewart and former political editor of the Sunday Mirror, Vincent Moss. And if you listen very carefully, Vincent, your dog in the background.
Absolutely, yes. I will try and keep him quiet, but Walter is currently chomping on a venison bone. So if any loud clicks appear, that's the dog eating the bone, which is my way of keeping him quiet, but it's not entirely worked.
Yes, I see. So you've got, keep him quiet by giving him a thing that makes a noise. Venison bone, though, that is a quality choice.
It is. He loves his venison, but it's better that than the squeaky toy.
For audio purposes, yes. Catriona, you're up first. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
I think this week will be remembered for a bid for transparency and trust in politicians inadvertently leading to more secrecy.
One of the key questions asked in the review was around the use of mobile messaging apps, such as WhatsApp. The report provides a clear recommendation in this regard, and we have taken the decision to end the use of mobile messaging applications across the Scottish Government.
Deputy First Minister Kate Forbes making an announcement in Holyrood. Catriona, what was she announcing? What's the story?
Well, it seems like the stuff of nightmares. You rattle off some candid thoughts about your colleagues, there might be a swear word or two in there, and you think nothing of it until your salty dislike for your peers is being read out in a court and making the front pages of newspapers. So, on a human level, I do feel sympathy for politicians who have been caught out in this particular story, which is the use of WhatsApp to conduct public business. And we are talking about the pandemic period, so they were responding under pressure and under unprecedented circumstances and trying to move quickly and efficiently. But the resulting mass deletion of WhatsApp messages by Scottish Government ministers has prompted an independent review of how the government stores and disseminates information. So now, as a result, WhatsApp and other messaging devices are going to be banned. But the question is, what is the long-term impact of that going to be? And is it going to have any impact at all?
Yeah. And what were the specific issues they were dealing with? Because I think we all remember Matt Hancock getting into trouble over his WhatsApps shortly after COVID. But what's the story been in Scotland?
Well, it was hugely controversial. During the COVID inquiry, some of these WhatsApp messages were read out to the court, and John Swinney, who's the current First Minister, had said some really inappropriate things. Hamza Yousaf, who was First Minister, had been using some quite unsavoury language. And I don't think the public are naive. I think they realise that politicians speak in this way, but just sort of seeing it all laid out was quite stark. And the National Clinical Director at the time, Jason Leach, had said that deleting his WhatsApp messages had become part of his bedtime routine. So the problem wasn't necessarily the content of the messages, it was the fact that it just smacked of a cover-up, that Nicola Sturgeon was deleting swathes of messages. She said that the civil service advice was deletion, and it meant that there was so much communication during a really, really vital period in Scottish history and UK history that we don't have the ins and outs of because all of these messages are gone.
I mean, Vincent, you can understand why this has happened, can't you? Not just COVID, but politicians having backstairs conversations off-the-record chats, debriefs, decompressing, being a bit rude about their colleagues. That's always happened in real life. It's just that now it's documented on a phone. Is that something that should be preserved for the public record?
I think, yes, you need transparency. I mean, I remember when I worked as an editor at Westminster for a couple of decades, this culture started and ministers deliberately used WhatsApp because their civil servants couldn't see what was on it and they wanted to act without others knowing. So they formed these little WhatsApp groups, talked to their advisors, often very, very rude about other people. And to their horror, some of those messages were later disclosed, as you alluded to in the Isabel Oakeshott story about the leaked WhatsApps that she'd gained from Matt Hancock, the former health secretary, for her book. But the real problem is, I think, is if you allow a secret subculture to operate, that's very bad for democracy and very bad for business. So either I think you ban it or you say it's fully disclosable, because the risk is that decision-making, as did happen during COVID in England and has happened in other elements of government, is made by WhatsApp, and that's not a good way to run a government.
How are other countries grappling with this problem, Rebecca? Because WhatsApp is very much an international platform.
Yeah, I mean, this is something that we're seeing becoming an issue especially in developed countries around the world. And the one that it made me think of straight away was France. We did a story on The Week earlier this year about the arrest of Pavel Durov, the CEO of Telegram, which is another one of these encrypted messaging apps, which was a real big embarrassment because he was arrested in France, basically because Telegram hasn't been complying with Parisian prosecutors' demands in cases. They're basically suggesting that Telegram is used to facilitate crimes, obviously because it's encrypted. Criminals can use it to, commit all sorts of offences. And that was a bit of an embarrassment because in France, Telegram is the app of government. The Macron administration has become really famous for its reliance on Telegram, and political journalists are all on there too. Basically, a lot of political chit-chat is being conducted, and political business as well, via Telegram. So this was a big embarrassment for them. And then last month, several Telegram accounts belonging to French parliamentarians were hacked in an apparent phishing attack. Apparently, one of the sort of methods the phishers used was to offer them photos of their primary school teachers. I tried to get to the bottom of whether they meant like compromising photos or whether they're just nostalgic photos. Anyway, several accounts were compromised. And this is amid a sort of effort by the French government to push ministers and lawmakers away from Telegram, WhatsApp and Signal. Ministers were actually banned from using those three platforms last year, but parliamentarians are still using them. But what the French government have done, which maybe has implications for the UK too, is they basically decided that ending government by messenger app is not realistic at this point. So now they've created their own in-house encrypted messaging app called CHAP, which they're trying to encourage all of France's lawmakers to adopt. But I feel like if the secrecy angle is the advantage of Telegram and WhatsApp, it's probably going to be a pretty difficult push to get them onto the monitored one.
Yes, well, this is it, isn't it, Kat? There's the issue about keeping information away from the electorate and your colleagues, but actually also away from criminals. And if you're pushing politicians away from a platform that we know is secure, in the form of something like WhatsApp, what are you pushing them to? What is the Scottish Government suggesting they use?
Well, government by WhatsApp's really become synonymous with bad governance, but I think there's a cultural issue there in that we expect politicians to be available 24/7, and these messaging services are really useful. The Scottish Government are saying that they are banning WhatsApp, they're banning any kind of similar messaging service. And it's interesting as well because WhatsApps are currently FOIable. The problem is the deletion, not the actual platform itself. So the Emma Martin review, which is the review that was looking into the dissemination and the holding of information and how the government's working towards transparency, said that this is actually about a complete culture change. It's not just about the technology. It's about how the technology is used. It's about encouraging politicians to be open and transparent. So the changes aren't coming in until next year. So at the moment, we don't actually know what the Scottish Government is going to suggest instead. And also there's the question of personal phones, because this only at the moment applies to government-issued devices. So it really it remains to be seen, but I do just think that this is going to move on to another platform. It's not going to solve the problem unless there is an absolute cultural change that says all of these messages have to be kept, and if they are FOI'd, they have to be shared with the public.
Yeah, I mean, you can't stop Keir Starmer dropping Rachel Reeves a personal text, can you, Vincent? That was always the case, just like they might have a chat in the lift.
Absolutely not. And I'm sure there'll always be a way that politicians and their advisors manage to do that. I think one of the particular reasons they used, and certainly in Westminster, WhatsApp a lot, is something called a SAR, Subject Access Request. Now, that means that if somebody writes or talks about you in an email, you can say, I want a subject access request, and I want every time my name has appeared in a government email. And you will see every time, if you're a journalist or a civil servant, the minister or his colleagues have been rude about you. And ministers got very quickly aware of this very soon, and they didn't want subject access requests all over their ministerial boxes, so they resorted to WhatsApp as a way of getting around that. So if you want to be really mean or rude about a journalist or a civil servant, you just stick it in the WhatsApp group. What you don't do is put it in the email, because that's disclosable. So what it led to was an awful lot of sort of colourful language on WhatsApp, some of which later became disclosed and was very embarrassing for the people involved, because they thought it was always going to be private, and it didn't remain so, much to their horror in some cases.
I mean, there's also, talking about the culture of WhatsApp and instant messaging, Rebecca, something else, isn't there, in the tone of these conversations? Because when I say, the Prime Minister can drop the Chancellor a text, that's not quite what WhatsApp is very often, is it? It's groups of people that share a particular worldview or a sense of humour, and I guess can lead... I mean, we've seen this with the Tory leadership frequently over the past few years, can lead to movements of, let's get rid of this person. I mean, that's why it has import.
Yeah, I mean, the problem with WhatsApp and the fact that we can't see the conversations and afterwards we often can't see them because they've been deleted by politicians, is that we don't know exactly what's being talked about. So it makes it kind of difficult to say. But I think most people would not have a huge reaction to the idea that politicians are backstabbing one another, are complaining and maybe saying some off-colour things. I mean, that's interesting from a sort of, salacious point of view, but it doesn't really impact on government. The issue is that with informal platforms like WhatsApp, it does encourage a sort of blurring of the lines between informal chit-chat between colleagues and then actual government business. It turns it into almost like a digital equivalent of the golf course, where the included people can have their off-the-record conversations, maybe have conversations that are advantageous to them in some way and exclusionary to other people. And that's an issue not just in terms of workplace culture, but, we've been talking about how WhatsApp messages have become relevant in regards to the pandemic. But the other thing that came out of the pandemic was obviously these conversations about government contracts being handed to people with connections to people in government. And I think people still feels very sensitive, rightly, over the idea of ministers having these sort of inscrutable, non-transparent background chats that are maybe going to impact on the business of government.
Do you think it's something that could be rolled across to other jobs, Kat? Because I imagine, if you ask the public, do you support the idea that politicians are banned from using WhatsApp? For all the kind of reasons that we've been saying, the public will say, yeah, absolutely. But when it comes to your own job, everyone uses WhatsApp with colleagues, don't they? Alongside their official Teams or Slack or whatever it is, messaging platform they're supposed to be on. Should we all stop using it for work?
I would push back strongly against that for me. I mean, I think now I would really struggle to do my job without WhatsApp or something similar, because again, it's this 24/7 culture. In journalism, we have a push towards quite high outputs now. So the most recent newspaper that I was working for had daily story targets, and you can't hit these kind of targets unless you are working constantly and you have very quick and efficient methods of communication. So if I'm writing a story and I need some kind of feedback on that, it's just send out a few WhatsApp messages and see what comes back. It's a lot more efficient than email. It's a lot quicker than email.
But it's not traceable. Your boss can't see it necessarily unless you're texting your boss. I mean, it's all the same issues, isn't it?
But then my boss wouldn't be able necessarily to see my emails or my text messages or any other kind of platform that I was using. And I don't really know why my boss would have to see my messages.
Well, I suppose the answer to that is if there's a legal complication in the future, or if someone makes a complaint about the way you dealt with something, you're right, your boss can't see your emails, but they can probably ask to see your emails. Do you know what I mean? Whereas your WhatsApp are just off limits.
But if I was sending a text message or using some other kind of messaging platform, it would be the same situation, and they'd have to ask me to supply them, which of course I would. Nothing to hide here unless it was protecting a source. But I just think there either needs to be a shift in culture and working practices, or we need to have this technology that's going to help us keep up.
I mean, you were saying the same thing, Vincent, really, like it needs to be declared or it needs to be stopped, not a kind of halfway house. Do you think either of those things is going to happen on a UK-wide basis?
No, not at the moment. I mean, there's an argument that the declaration thing should happen in government, but I remember politicians telling me that if their WhatsApps were declared and fully transparent, they would not only be out of a job, but they would be out of a marriage and probably lose most of their chums as well, because people can be very frank on WhatsApp. I'm sure we all are. And if they were disclosed, there is a risk with that. So it's a very tricky area. I mean, I'm probably leaning on the side of full transparency. I would say that as a journalistic background. I'm sure Kat's the same, that if you're going to have these issues, then they should be fully transparent. But I just think there's always a workaround. People value confidentiality. People always want to talk about things without everybody on the team knowing, whether that's a government or a newspaper or any other social network. And I think there'll always be a workaround, won't there? So you can probably regulate WhatsApp. Somebody will find somewhere else to go and have their private conversations.
Yeah, but the one that always gets me is the sending the message to the person the message is about. Just once every couple of years.
We've all done it. It's a nightmare, isn't it?
Absolutely horrendous. Okay, next up, ding ding. Is it the end of the road for autonomous buses? That's after this. Okay, Rebecca, your turn. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
This is the week we said farewell to the fleet of 5 on the Firth of Forth.
Whoa, the sound of the future there. STV treating us to the sound of the world's first driverless bus service, which, I had no idea about this, runs between Fife and Edinburgh. Or it did, but it might not in the future, Rebecca.
Yeah, that's right. Unfortunately, I think you've missed your chance here, Ollie. This is the Cav Forth service. It began running in May 2023, operated by Stagecoach, using a fleet of 5 autonomous vehicles. They basically look like buses. They are, in fact, buses.
They sound like buses.
Yeah, I say autonomous vehicles. To the naked eye, they are buses, and actually for more reasons than you might think. We'll get into that. They were built at an estimated cost of £6 million, partly subsidised by the government, and they were running on a 14-mile route between Fife and Edinburgh over the Firth of Forth Bridge. But the project is now going to be wound down due to low passenger uptake. The kind of irony being that it's a very busy commuter route, but it's so busy that there are already a lot of buses on it, and apparently the numbers just weren't making it worthwhile.
I mean, Kat, you've been on this bus route, I understand. What's it like?
It's just like being on a regular bus. I mean, there is a bit of sleight of hand here. I remember the day that Stagecoach and the Scottish Government and all the involved partners had a big press call about this driverless bus, and the journalists all turned up, and who's sitting behind the wheel but a driver? And actually, it needed 2 staff members rather than 1, because it had a driver and it also had a ticket collector on board. So it was hailed as being this magical new service, but actually was very difficult to distinguish from any other bus that you were on.
But the reason that driver was there, Vincent, is because of UK legislation that says a driver has to be there in an autonomous vehicle in case it starts buggering up. But that doesn't mean that the technology underneath it couldn't drive the bus by itself. And I guess the theory was always, we'll get people over this hurdle of ickiness and the legislative issues, and they'll see that the bus can drive itself, and then we'll be off to the races. Is that going to happen, or is this a major stumbling block for autonomous buses?
I think it is a problem, really, isn't it? One of public confidence, really. I think people, even if they know the bus is automated, they want to see that driver there. And I think Seoul in South Korea tried driverless night buses, but there was still a driver sitting in the driver's seat in case of emergencies. And I think when you're on those buses and they're driverless, I've seen the only closest I've seen is the Docklands Light Railway, for example, in London, where those are driverless. But it somehow feels different and safer if you're effectively on a monorail and you know that it can't go anywhere than if you're on a bus, particularly on a mountainous road. I'd be very nervous of being on a bus on a curvy road if it was automated. I'd feel a lot safer if a driver was sitting there, which of course defeats the object of a driverless bus. And I think one of the big things we're seeing with public transport in the UK is huge shortage. One of the problems with trains, for example, and the same with buses, is there aren't enough drivers in many areas. People don't want to do it as much. That's one of the reasons why train drivers are getting paid a lot of money, is because there's a shortage of them. So one of the solutions is, as with a lot of these tech things, get tech to solve the problem. But it's not going to solve it entirely if people are still too nervous to do it. And I think faced with a driverless bus, I probably wouldn't get on it at the moment. Just don't feel secure enough.
But presumably there are other territories, Rebecca, where this stuff's being tested out. I mean, I'm guessing California, where it will reach a threshold where people do feel safe, and then other countries around the world just want to keep up. They'll want the same technology they have over there.
Yeah, I mean, there are a few. As you mentioned, America is sort of at the forefront of this, and China as well. But they're all quite limited. You know, there's a shuttle bus that runs in Las Vegas, but it only runs sort of a long one strip, and it only goes at 16 miles an hour, even though it could reach 30, which I think is sort of a metaphor for the obstacle facing the whole thing, is that we could go bigger on this.
I mean, impressive can go at 16 miles per hour on the Las Vegas Strip. Normally about 2 miles per hour in my experience.
Well, quite. But I think this is the thing. It's like, it's not about limitations that technology, it's limitations in public confidence, and also not just public confidence, but nobody wants to be the mayor or the prime minister or the CEO who's associated with some horrible accident involving autonomous vehicles, even though on paper the driving would likely be much safer than human drivers. But one self-driving vehicle accident is obviously going to generate a lot more attention, a lot more backlash than the thousands of accidents caused by humans every day. But I do think, we're at the stage where the main obstacle is acceptance. I mean, a similar self-driving bus scheme is still supposed to be trialled in Sunderland, Milton Keynes. It is still pushing on. Beyond the UK, Hamburg are currently trialling an autonomous shuttle bus system. These are really small buses, because the idea is that the way that we travel now has changed a lot, and that traditional buses, running fixed routes at fixed times, don't necessarily take us where we want to go anymore. So the idea is that it would almost be like a fleet of mini taxis that could come and pick you up at any time. Again, as Vincent was saying, that would be impossible to do with human drivers, because there just aren't enough employees willing to do that. So it is a really great idea, but I do think there are safety concerns, and not just safety about the tech, but also if you think about how it would be to be on a driverless bus, would a woman feel safe alone on one at night? How would a disabled person get on board if there was no one to lower a ramp? What if someone had a heart attack on an empty one? There are concerns beyond just the tech itself, and things that do need to be thought through.
Yeah, I mean, there are still autonomous systems being pushed ahead in Scotland, aren't there, Kat, including the new Glasgow subway system. Are they answering those kinds of questions?
Well, I mean, I feel like a terrible Luddite when we talk about all of this sort of thing, but with the Glasgow subway, they introduced all of these fancy newfangled trains last year, but actually there were problems getting them round the route. So it turned out that these new trains were actually slower than they were in Victorian times. We also have terrible public transport in Scotland. In Glasgow in particular, we don't have integrated ticketing, we don't have a decent night bus service, the buses aren't franchised, it's really, really expensive. So it is quite interesting to watch the Scottish Government invest money in autonomous buses when this bus service was never going to be fully autonomous until 2040. But actually, you can't get a normal bus to go to work or to go to the shops. So I sort of think they should be focusing on the basics before going with the fancy autonomy.
Yeah, I mean, and that's a story that we see across political parties, isn't it, Vincent? The sexy investments in things like HS2 is obviously the famous one from the last decade, really, are the things that attract the big money and the foreign partners and all the rest of it. But actually the public, the voters, they just want to get from A to B.
Yes, they want to get from A to B as quickly as possible on a reliable service. And wherever you live in the country, that seems to be increasingly hard, whether it's buses, trains, and the rest of it. And one of the key solutions is exactly this kind of driverless technology, but it's just not it's costing a huge amount of money. I think the buses I was talking about earlier in South Korea, they're about $1 million a bus. So you've got to invest a huge amount of money up front before you start to save it on the kind of staffing costs of staffing these. The key is reliability and confidence in the service, and people just don't have that on transport at the moment, I think.
But do you, Rebecca, see this inflection point, this tipping point around the corner, where trust has been gained or the costs have come down?
Yeah, I think we have to get there eventually. I think the reason that the Cav Forth story, in Edinburgh, it's the reason it's not the most eye-grabbing story at first glance is because it wasn't cancelled due to, a horrible accident or a near miss, but for the same reason most bus routes are, low uptake. But that kind of gets to the crux of the issue. Low uptake wouldn't have been so much of a problem if they hadn't been paying 2 employees to be on the bus at all times. So we are going to have to get to the point where we have to let the driverless buses run free. But that's such a big line to cross. But what it reminds me of is, if you think back to the early days of aviation, essentially to simplify it way too much, people just kept dying until we made safer planes. We didn't ban aviation because so many of the early aviators are being killed. And I think now our appetite for risk is much lower as a society, which I think on the whole is a good thing. But it does mean that we are sort of still balanced on this precipice, not quite sure if we should step over or not.
Well, I suppose the answer to that is there wasn't a safer alternative to flight then. was there? I suppose hot air balloons, but that was pretty slow. Whereas now we have a safe alternative to driverless buses, which is a bus with a driver on it.
Well, yeah, but I mean, it's like we didn't need to go up in the sky at all, did we? If you were a conservative-minded person in 1910, you might think this is getting way too big for our boots. There's a reason that God made oceans and ships for us to sail across them on. You know, I think it was seen as a bit of an eccentric pursuit in the early days. Whereas I do think actually now there is a much more, you know, no one sees self-driving cars and vehicles anymore, I think, as being just sort of an eccentricity that only Silicon Valley bros care about. I do think everyone is sort of getting into a consensus that this is probably the future, but I think, the problem is that nobody really wants to be the passengers on them.
Kat?
I was really interested to learn that the first self-driving car was unveiled in 1939, and I think that kind of speaks volumes that it's been such a length of time since this was mooted as a possibility, and we still haven't got there.
I know, and every time I see the Jetsons, I'm like, why do we still not have the flying cars? We've got FaceTime. How difficult can it be?
Jetpacks.
Right. Okay. Up next, more from the coalface of the convergence of technology and transport. That's after this. All right, Vincent, you are finishing the show. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Well, Ollie, I think this week should be remembered for those motorists in Devon and Cornwall who found out that they were guinea pigs in the world's first trial of a controversial new artificial intelligence technology.
Now, I know this might seem hard to believe, but I don't actually take my family on sightseeing trips to go and find new and intrusive Big Brother cameras. But we've just been for a day out in, Croyd, down in Devon, and I've been treated by the sight of this camera behind me. So let's go and take a look. This is one of these new AI cameras to catch people on their mobile phones. And, let's go and have a look, shall we? Definitely intrusive.
YouTuber Jeff Buys Cars having a fun family day out back in the summer. Vincent, what is the story?
Well, this is not just about ordinary roadside cameras that are mobile and can be moved around. We've probably all seen them, that catch people speeding. The thing about these cameras that makes them different, really, is in addition to sort of spotting people speeding, spotting people not wearing their seatbelt, and potentially spotting people who are using their mobile phones, they're using cloud-based AI technology to look at the possibility you may be under the influence of drink or drugs, because it's analysing driving habits via these cloud-based algorithms, and it alerts the police, and you could be stopped later down the road because the AI suspects, doesn't know for sure, hasn't tested you. That would have to be the roadside test further down the road, but it suspects there's something up with your driving. I think what's fascinating about this technology is, where does that end? And what else can this tech do? Presumably the algorithm's going to look at all sorts of other aspects as well. It might look at the kind of car you're driving, might look at whether you speed up and slow down. So I just think it's quite a dangerous, potentially Big Brother, is it a Minority Report type scenario where it's thinking, okay, this AI is thinking, I don't like the way Vincent drives, I think we're going to give him a stop.
Okay, well, thank you for painting a dystopian picture about where we might be heading. Just tell us exactly what's happened this week then.
So this week was the first trial of a new technology about these mobile roadside spy cameras which can look at motorists and their driving habits using the latest AI technology to assess their driving.
So they're doing it. This thing you were just saying, this is a scary vision of the future, they're doing that now. So there's AI cameras that can assess the way you're driving and then work backwards from that and predict that you may have been drinking.
Exactly that. They're using an algorithm, this new device called the Heads Up machine, which is produced by an Australian tech company, and it analyses your driving. So not just speeding, which is a fairly obvious thing that it could check for, but it analyses your driving and then will alert police if it thinks you may be under the influence of drink or drugs.
And that's the new bit, Rebecca, but this company that supplies the AI, those cameras were already being used to monitor mobile phone use, as the chap was saying in the video there, and also seatbelt compliance as well.
As Vincent mentioned, it's an Australian company. They're called AccuSensors, and they started out using this with the government of New South Wales in 2018. And within 3 months, they detected 11,000 instances of drivers using their phones. Following 2 more trials of the same system in Sydney the next year, they got to a total of 100,000 drivers who all received warnings. And I should say, all the footage flagged by the cameras is reviewed by a human agent before enforcement action is taken, like sending a warning letter, for instance. And since 2019, they've been a permanent fixture of roads in New South Wales. And actually, actually, AccuSense has partnered with Devon and Cornwall Police on a couple of occasions in recent years to use this same technology. And again, in the first 72 hours, their system detected 117 drivers using their mobile phones at the wheel, 180 not wearing a seatbelt. But this particular new technology, it's called impairment detection tech. That is a new feature. It was developed last year by AccuSensus, partly, and the way they did it was fascinating. Partly they used data from a driving simulator, and which was sort of programmed to follow the routes of real life roads in Sydney and Melbourne. And they would have volunteers drive along them, and the volunteers were either sober or under the influence, and they would use that data to study the driving patterns.
That's a fun day of market research, isn't it?
Yeah, I was trying to work out, were they the same volunteers? And you have them do it sober, and then you give them a few drinks and have them do it again. But by gathering all of that data of how drunk people drive, they were able to then create this new detection technology.
I guess then, Kat, you sort of end up with this thing of people who are going to drink and drive. I mean, the point is you shouldn't be drinking and driving at all. Then thinking about how they can evade the detection technology, like learn the techniques that the cameras might be looking for and work around that.
Yes, I mean, with AI cameras generally, there are already people trying to work out how to avoid the technology. So there was recently a student at Nottingham Trent University who created a special reflective hat and jumper and trousers that you could wear if you wanted to walk around and avoid being detected by AI cameras. But with these ones, presumably, people will work out ways around them as well. I mean, at the moment, the detection rate for AI cameras is only about 75%. So it does make them far less accurate than existing systems. But there's a sense here that the stable door is already open and the horse is bolted, because once you are drunk behind the wheel, you're a danger to yourself, you're a danger to other people. And really, it feels like this should be more about cultural change. I mean, some of the numbers that Rebecca just shared there are quite astonishing. And so you hope that this sort of thing comes along with public information campaigns and some kind of wider crackdown to stop this behaviour before it becomes an issue.
Yeah, but it's not happening in a vacuum, is it? I mean, Vincent, we've seen a massive fall in the numbers of drink driving incidents in the last 3 decades, say. The trend has been downwards. People do now understand that if they're going to drink, to only drink a little. They do think about it when they get on the road. And it's something that, you know, in the 60s and 70s wasn't even discussed.
That's right, a bit like seatbelts, which weren't, very old people will not have been subject to the laws even on seatbelts. And I think the road safety element of it and cracking down on drink drivers and people using drugs while driving is to be welcomed. I think the risk element of this is the prospect that you might be driving along a country road and you're stopped down the road by a policeman or policewoman who says, our AI has detected something about your driving that we don't like. And you say, well, what's that? And they would presumably say, well, the AI doesn't like it. And I think that's a rather dangerous precedent to be setting. And if it becomes acceptable on the roads, is it going to be acceptable along the pavements? Are you going to have cameras, as we already have in terms of the facial recognition that Kat was talking about, stopping you for some kind of reason? I mean, I don't want to be too alarmist about it, but I just find there's not really been any public debate about the rollout of this element of AI. And it just strikes me as something that should be discussed a bit wider than it has been. These cameras are just appearing. They've got an AI element to them, and there's a possibility. People would accept and understand if you're stopped because you're speeding, if you're stopped because you're driving dangerously, or would understand if you're stopped because you're drunk. But I don't think they'd understand if they're stopped just because the AI doesn't like the way they're driving.
Well, I mean, the AI would be, having ingested thousands of hours of this sort of footage, predicting that you might be about to have an accident of the type that someone has when they've been drinking. So isn't that just the same as a human being doing it?
Well, that's right, I suppose. It just feels a bit Minority Report to me, because there could be lots of reasons you might be speeding up and slowing down. You might, and I don't condone this, but we all know people who drive their cars and a particular song comes on the radio or on their whatever device they're using, and they speed up a little bit. And then they might be listening to something classical, and they might slow down a little bit. So there might be perfectly legitimate reasons why your driving speed changes or something changes. You might be on the phone having a chat with somebody, hands-free obviously. That might affect your driving speed at the pace you go. Does that mean you then need to be stopped down the road by the police? Obviously, if the AI sees you weaving all over the road because you're drunk, I think that's legitimate. But it just worries me that it could go a bit beyond its remit.
Yeah, I mean, on the issue of consent, Rebecca, there is something there, isn't there? In that, people, when they choose to sign up to a service like Facebook, for example, know that they're uploading photos of themselves into the cloud. They get used for commercial purposes. But do all of us as members of the public consent to our faces and bodies being scanned by the authorities to predict algorithms on our behaviour Is that something we've had a vote on that we've all agreed is the right way for the country to be policed?
No, we haven't consented to it. And I think one of the big criticisms of AccuSensors, because obviously they've been around for a while now, first in Australia and now moving into the UK, is that it gathers data on every car that passes. I mean, what AccuSensors would say is that all that data is deleted. If it's not followed up on, it gets completely deleted. No human will ever look at it, etc., etc. But I think it depends, sort of where you fall in terms of whether you object in principle to the idea that your face, your car, your registration number, etc., it's all being recorded as you go past. Yes, it gets deleted if you're not being flagged for anything. Yes, maybe no human will ever see it. But I do think there are grounds that you could just object to that whole system on principle. But I think it will probably save lives in the sense that when I was thinking about it, I was thinking, of course, any driver that is flagged by this system then has to be followed up with by a human police officer stationed further down the road. Now,
which is saving them resources as well, of course.
Yeah, but of course, if someone was driving all over the road and a police car was parked there watching traffic, you'd like to think that they would notice that themselves. But I do think it will be effective at catching people who aren't necessarily weaving all over the road. The AI is able to pick up on really small anomalies, which if you're a human police officer and you're observing sometimes, large amounts of passing traffic, you might easily miss those very small signs. But then, as Vincent said, that is when it starts to blur the line into how erratically do you have to be driving, theoretically, to be picked up by the system. Is it going to lead to a situation where lots of motorists are being stopped because at the split second they passed under that camera, maybe they spilt a drink on themselves or something. So, there is a concern that it could lead to over-policing. But I think, the state of the police force in terms of staffing at the moment, there's probably no danger that we're going to be overly policed.
I mean, surely the real question, Kat, just to tie all the threads together, is what does an AI camera do when it sees an autonomous bus driver behaving erratically? We just get war of the machines.
Well, indeed, but at the moment that's not something that has to consider because we don't have any autonomous buses.
I guess we have AI kind of everywhere, though, don't we? That's the thing that I just slightly kind of try and bear in mind when we have these moments of hysteria about what AI might do, is that there's AI just baked into everything we're using all the time now. It's AI that's choosing my Netflix recommendations for me. And maybe particularly younger people just aren't actually bothered about that. They welcome it, they're used to it. It's becoming ingrained in everything. Yeah,
and I said in our last section that I do feel a bit of a Luddite when it comes to these sorts of things. I mean, one of the pushes for autonomous vehicles is that they increase productivity because you can work while the car is driving you somewhere. Do we have to be productive all the time? It makes me think of The Little Prince, the French children's book, where he asked what would he do if he had a pill that meant that he didn't have to drink water and that would save him 53 minutes a day. And he said that he would use the spare time to walk towards a fresh well of water. And I feel very old when it comes to discussing all this technology. But yes, of course, you're absolutely right, Ollie. There is going to be a point where people will not remember when we didn't have AI. And for cars, it's a huge issue. 50 million people are injured in road traffic crashes every year. 1.3 million people die on the roads each year. We're talking about drink driving, but of course, there's just the kind of basic human element to this. Next week marks the 10th anniversary of the bin lorry crash in Glasgow, where Glasgow City Council bin lorry driver Harry Clark fainted behind the wheel and killed 6 people in Glasgow city centre. Could AI have prevented that if there was something in the cab that detected that he was going to pass out and stop the car? You can't complain about AI improving road safety in that sort of regard.
Do you think there's going to be more of this, Vincent? This is just the tip of the iceberg.
I think so. It's happening in every walk of life. We touched on earlier the facial recognition stuff, which has gone fairly unnoticed in many ways. And yet I was looking at some figures in the FT the other day where 700,000 people have had their faces analysed over the last 5 years. And there are positives. It's a question, isn't it, between good and bad AI. Stuff we like helps us choose the music, although you could argue when it comes to choosing music that you don't have the serendipity of that unknown band because the algorithm won't find you that kind of great moment when you discover a new band because it's giving you stuff it knows you already like. And it's that difference between welcoming the good but dealing with some of the bad stuff and having a more open debate about it. My big fear is that government thinks AI is going to solve all of its productivity problems, lead to this desperate growth that the government needs, and it's the universal solution to all of our problems. I'm just not entirely convinced that's the case.
Well, as we all know, listening to The Week Unwrapped every week makes you a better driver and also more physically attractive. So remember to follow this show for free. Do it now. Get every episode as soon as it's released. Just search for The Week Unwrapped wherever you get your podcasts and then tap follow. My thanks to Rebecca, to Catriona and to Vincent. Oh, and do remember, just for being a Week Unwrapped listener at the moment, you can get 6 weeks completely free, then save an extra £5 on a quarterly subscription to the magazine. Visit theweek.com/flash24 for that and use the promo code FLASH24. In the meantime, happy Christmas. I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer Ollie Peart at Rethink Audio. And until we meet again to unwrap the year next week, bye-bye.